Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome into my official reaction to the college football AP Top 25 that was just released here. This is going into week number 10. You did have Oregon destroy Illinois 38 to 9. I think they were like 20-point favorites. Illinois, certainly in watching their game against Michigan, even though they won that game, it was very clear they had a very bad offense, and Oregon easily handles them. They have 61 overall first place votes. You do have Georgia getting one first place votes, but right now it's pretty much consensus that Oregon, they've got that win over Ohio State. They just got a nice, impressive win over the Illini. They are the number one team in college football. You do have Georgia sitting at number two. They had a bye week. They obviously, I would say, pretty consensus would say they're the number two team. You could argue maybe Penn State because they're undefeated, but Georgia with the resume, they're sitting at 6-1. You do have Penn State at number three. They beat Wisconsin. Drew Aller injured, so we'll have to see. They've obviously got the huge game against Ohio State. I know a lot of Penn State fans mad about that game being on at noon. I was hoping for a 3:30 game, but once again, it's like Ohio State and Penn State. It's in the what is it, big noon purgatory. Every year that game is at noon. So that's unfortunate for Penn State. If that game was at night, I mean, my goodness, Ohio State with their offensive line problems. And if you remember Ohio State, who barely beat Nebraska. That was a very close game, competitive game, 21-17. Back when they lost to Penn State back in like 2017, they had a horrible offensive line situation. And again, going to Penn State, they have a terrible offensive line situation. They lost their left tackle, Josh Simmons, like midway through the game against Oregon. And the left tackle that they had this past week who got injured, he was horrific. I think they're probably going to push out Donovan Jackson to be left tackle, but this is not a good situation for Ohio State with a really shaky offensive line going into that environment. Penn State at 7-0. Maybe Drew Aller won't play. I know the opening line in that game is Ohio State -3.5. I would imagine it'll get bet down to at least 2 just because of the offensive line issues for Ohio State. But that'll be a very interesting game. Could this finally be the year Penn State gets Ohio State? It's been like 6 or 7 straight wins for the Buckeyes, but it's going to be very close. There's no doubt about it. And I mean, we wish the game was on later, but it is a noon game. That's going to be huge. If Ohio State loses that game, they've got no margin for error. They're not going to make the Big Ten championship. They're going to have to win out and then possibly get like a 10 or 11 seed. Penn State, they've got a ton of margin for error here, already sitting at 7-0. You lose to Ohio State, obviously you can still very easily make the playoff. And that is an impressive win on the road at Wisconsin. That was a very close game late in the first half. Wisconsin, they're a team that's played a lot better recently, and they end up pulling it out or really pulling away and covering that spread there. You do have Miami sitting at number 5, so they are right now 8-0. They moved up one spot over Texas. They beat Florida State handily. Florida State is terrible this year. There's really not a lot I can say about Miami. You know, they've had some very, very, very close wins. I do think Clemson is better than Miami at this point, but Miami is the team that's undefeated. So right now they are at number 5. You do have Texas sitting at 7-1. A 3-point win against Vanderbilt, kind of a weird game. They outgained Vanderbilt by 170 yards, but a close game nonetheless. I mean, Vanderbilt's a decent team this year, beating Alabama, being competitive. But when it comes to Texas, it just feels like they're a little bit overrated. I mean, I still don't think they have a big win on their resume because their big win was at Michigan, and it turns out Michigan's not very good. So Texas right now sitting at number 6. Tennessee, they had a bye. They didn't move at all. They're at number 7. Notre Dame moves up 4 spots to number 8. So yes, Notre Dame is loved analytically, and it's not surprising they moved up this much. Notre Dame crushed Navy 51-14. And the part of that was Navy like turning the ball over 6 times, but it's still an impressive win to beat Navy by that margin. What was it, like a 37-point margin? They were like 12.5-point favorites. So Notre Dame, listen, it's very simple with Notre Dame. With their analytics, I can guarantee people, or I would be shocked if they did not make the playoff winning out. A lot of what's going to happen with Notre Dame, it just comes down to their analytics. And right now, they're like a top 6 team. There is a scenario where maybe they finish 11-1, but they don't have great analytics. They don't have an unbelievable. I mean, I still don't think they're going to have that great of a resume, honestly, because it's like Navy was ranked, but what if Navy drops like 2 more games? Is that really going to be that impressive of a win? Probably not. But if Notre Dame was like 11-1 and they were kind of a fraudulent team in terms of the margins of which they were winning games, I could see them missing it just because they don't have a conference championship. But them right now going 11-1, they're probably going to make it. The question is, will they be able to host the first round? And I would probably say, I think if they're a 7 seed, I think they'll host the 8. So maybe they will. But if they go 11-1, I do think they'll definitely make it. If they lose another game, they're out because they have a horrible loss against Northern Illinois. That's another thing to look at. You've got BYU. They won again, so they beat UCF. They were actually underdogs in that game, but they win and they're at 8-0. So they're the best team in the Big 12 right now. The Big 12, I still think BYU is going to lose some games. It's just a mosh pit. Texas A&M beat LSU. I mean, to me, both of those teams are fraudulent. A&M, they could not throw the ball, but they won. LSU, I never really liked this year, but A&M now, they're 7-1. They lost that game to Notre Dame. I guess that is Notre Dame's big win, so I'm sure Notre Dame's happy that A&M keeps winning. But we'll see what happens with A&M. Clemson falls 2 spots pretty much just because BYU moved in front of them. A&M moved in front of them. They had a bye. Iowa State was idle as well. Indiana ended up beating Washington 31-17. So they did cover that spread with their starting quarterback being out. And listen, there's a lot of people saying that Indiana maybe should have moved up a little bit here. They've got the huge game against Ohio State. Listen, they've got Michigan State and Michigan, 2 winnable games. They're possibly going to be 10-0 when they face Ohio State. Very possible. I don't think they're going to beat Ohio State, but we'll see. That game is on the road for Indiana, and I think it's going to be a 3:30 start. Alabama up 1 spot to number 14. Yeah, so they beat Missouri 34-0. Missouri, that was not. I mean, I think Missouri is kind of overrated anyways, but that team was injured. I mean, their starting quarterback shouldn't have even went out there. Brady Cook. Alabama took advantage of it. They won 34-0. You've got Boise State moving up 2 spots. They beat UNLV. That's the Friday night game. Genty was kind of shut down. He averaged like 3.8 yards per carry, but I still think he's the Heisman favorite. They're sitting at 6-1. You've got LSU at 6-2 now. They're down 8 spots. They lose to A&M. You've got Kansas State down 1 spot. They barely beat Kansas. I mean, to be fair, Kansas is a lot better than their record. I know it's like they're like 2-5 or whatever, but they're better than that analytically. But still not a great performance by Kansas State. It is kind of a rivalry. You do have Pittsburgh. They're 7-0. They crushed Syracuse. Remember that Friday night game, or was it a Thursday night game? Kyle McCord, 5 interceptions. Listen, Pittsburgh is 7-0. We'll see. I think they're going to lose a few games, but right now they are undefeated. Ole Miss down 1 spot. They beat Oklahoma. Kind of an uninspired performance. They end up not covering that spread against a reeling Oklahoma team. 26-14. SMU barely beats Duke. That was not a good performance by SMU. Duke went for 2 at the end of that game, didn't get it. That's why they were able to win 28-27. Army moves up 2 spots. They're still undefeated. They had a bye week. Washington State is now ranked. Kind of interesting with Washington State. They really have a very easy schedule, but they're still like it's weird because it's a Mountain West schedule, but they're not. They don't have a conference, so it's an odd dynamic. Like Washington State, if they were in the Big Ten or they were in like if the Pac-12 still existed, there's no way they're 7-1. But they're ranking them, so I guess we'll see what happens with them. They barely beat San Diego State, and San Diego State's not a good team. Colorado enters the top 25 after beating Cincinnati. Cincinnati's had a decent year, so that's a solid win for Colorado. You do have Illinois moving down 4 spots. I think Illinois should be knocked off, personally. They are 6-2, but that's just you lose a game like that. That was not a competitive game against Oregon at all. That was a total blowout from the start. Missouri, I think Missouri should be gone too. I mean, I guess they're 6-2, but they get crushed by Alabama. You do have Vanderbilt still receiving votes even after losing to Texas. You've got Memphis. I think Memphis is 7-1. Tulane is really good in terms of the analytics. Navy is still getting votes, but they got knocked off. Louisville, Arkansas. Arkansas's got a really potent offense. UNLV, what is this? Louisiana Lafayette. So Louisiana and then South Carolina getting a vote as well. So overall, what I would say right now, Oregon, you don't want to call them a lock at this point. I mean, they've got this next game on the road at Michigan. Michigan, you would think they'd be able to beat Michigan. I don't know what they'll be, like 15, 16-point favorites in that game on the road. But Oregon's getting to the point where they're almost a lock. Penn State has, you've got a margin of like losing 2 games. Miami, I don't know. We'll see with Miami. But some of these teams like Oregon, Georgia, Ohio, well, we'll see what happens with Ohio State against Penn State. But, some of these teams are getting close to where they're very likely going to make the playoff. But there is still a lot of unknowns, honestly, because it's like BYU, I could still see very easily missing the playoff, even though they're 8-0 right now because of their conference. But either way, guys, that is going to do it for this video. Make sure you follow me on X. Link to that's always in the description.